continue. There we go. All right, and grab mic. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for jumping on with us. It's 3 o'clock, it's Thursday, so another Agave session chat. Thank you so much to everybody who has been jumping on and joining us either live or watching it on our Facebook channel or the Samson Surrey TV YouTube channel. Been really, really lucky, and some of the people that we've gotten to come on and chat with us, and that lucky streak continues this week. We have somebody who I have not interacted with face-to-face a ton, but have been following their project for a while now and really has a lot of kind of buzz about it in the Mezcal community. And that project is NETA Spirits, operating out of Oaxaca. And this afternoon, I'm lucky enough to be joined by Niki Nakazawa. Niki, are you there? How's it going?
Hello. Hey, nice to see you.
You too. You too. Thank you so much for jumping on with us this afternoon. I'm really excited to talk to you guys, talk about what you guys are doing with NETA, and kind of, you know, talking about the co-op model a little bit that you guys work with, and just learning a lot about, you know, how you guys are approaching what you're doing with NETA. So thank you so much for jumping on with us.
Great.
So I guess that being said, let's go ahead and kind of jump into it. You know, can you tell us first a little bit about what it is that NETA does and who you all work with, and maybe a little bit about kind of how you got involved with NETA, because I think your time and experience in Mexico goes a little bit beyond really your work specifically with Mezcal. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So I think that I'll start by talking a little bit about my background and maybe Max's background, and then talking about what we've been doing with NETA, because it's been a really slow process coming to market. But both Max and I have been living in Mexico for, me, in my case, almost 13 years now in November, and Max about 8 years. So there was kind of like a long preamble and introduction to Mezcal happened about 15 years ago. And then, you know, the the process of actually starting a company and exporting Mezcal to the States is something that is of the past 2-3 years. So I moved to Mexico City in 2007, right out of college. I had been studying at the University of Chicago, a lot of Mexican history. It was an interdisciplinary studies program, but I had the opportunity to study in Oaxaca in 2005. And I studied with fantastic historian who's since passed, of Mexican history and the Mexican Revolution. And this was kind of the beginning of my relationship with Mexico. So the first, I would say, 6 years that I lived in Mexico City, I was working in publishing, art, architecture, design, and at a contemporary art gallery called Labor. So moving kind of more in the art space. And then in 2012, started this pop-up restaurant in Mexico City called Pichon. So one of my best friends and I, Emma Rosenbusch, who is based in San Francisco, she moved to Mexico City and had been working in prison advocacy work and in some farmers markets there. And we got this idea to do this kind of farm to table pop-up in Mexico City, working with farmers in the 100-kilometer radius of Mexico City, and particularly with farmers working in Xochimilco. In this project, trying to revitalize sustainable organic agriculture in the Chinampa System. So that project started in 2012, and we were kind of working as a collective of people, both in the arts and in food, for about 5 years. And it was during that period that I met Max. So this is also 2012, 2013. Max has been living between Oakland and Oaxaca, mostly the mountains of Oaxaca, the Sierra in San Mateo. And at that point in 2012, he met the first family producers that we today work with. So this is Hermogenes Vasquez and Paula Quino Sanchez. So this is the couple, husband and wife team of producers that kind of opened the door to Logoche and to kind of all these producers in Mihuatlan. So yeah, 2012, Max and I meet. He was living like 6 months Oaxaca, mostly in the mountains, 6 months Oakland. And in that time that he was moving between these two places, he would stay with my boyfriend and I at the time's place in Mexico City and drop off mezcal and, you know, bring some mezcal in his suitcases, share it with friends in Oakland, got connected with the mezcalistas people. And I started integrating some of these mezcales into the food events that I was doing. So it's been a really long process. And in that period of time where Max was, bringing like small amounts of mezcal back and forth from the States, Oaxaca to the States, he left quite a lot of mezcal with me in Mexico City. And so I started hosting tastings out of my apartment. I had, my crew of local clients who would come and be like, I want a liter of whatever. And I would just fill up a Coke bottle with a funnel and, just host little tastings. So that's how we got our start. And, that was now, something like 7-8 years ago. And I moved to Oaxaca from Mexico City 2 years ago. And we then had our third business partner, Yusuke Murayama, who's kind of our business guy, and somebody who I've been friends with for over 15 years, get involved and help us really bring this from like a suitcase operation and a small tasting room out of my apartment in Mexico City to what we are today.
So the third partner, I think I had done some a little bit of reading somewhere and see like that was kind of where it made more of a transition from just an idea to an actual functional, sustainable business model, right?
Yes.
Awesome. If I can backtrack a little bit, what was it that first really drew you to actually want to start studying and spending so much focus on Mexico?
I think that it was really kind of almost an accident. In my second year of college, I was, my mother's from Uruguay, and I was really interested in studying post-dictatorial Southern Cone Latin America. At the University of Chicago, the strong suit was Mexican Studies, and it has a really incredible Mexican Studies department, which is associated with the Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City. So as I was kind of in the Latin American Studies department, and I studied abroad in Oaxaca, I just fell into these incredible classes. And also Oaxaca, when I came to Oaxaca for the first time, I was like, this is crazy. I was like, I can't believe I haven't been here before. And I felt so at home and so fascinated. And after my first kind of encounters with Oaxaca and the period of time that I spent here, I then realized that my family had a long history with Mexico as well. That my dad had spent time in Mexico in the 70s, that my grandmother, my tia abuela on my mother's side was a diplomat, a Uruguayan diplomat in Mexico. So there's these long kind of lines through both of my parents, and both my parents love Mexico as well. So
that's very cool.
Yeah.
I think we would be a little bit remiss if we didn't mention, especially given what an agricultural product mezcal obviously is. For those of you guys who don't know, for the people who aren't that familiar with it, could you kind of quickly give us an explanation? You mentioned earlier because A, for me, it's fascinating, and B, it was kind of one of the foundations of really the Aztec culture was the Chinampa system. Can you kind of give people a quick rundown of what that was and why that was so important to the Aztecs? Well, yeah, I guess Aztecs.
So yeah, the Chinampa system in Xochimilco, or the Chinampa system in general, is so incredibly fascinating. And this was the first intensive irrigation system of the Americas. And so I believe that the first Chinampas were built in the 1400s. And so basically, Chinampas are artificial agricultural islands. And the process by which you build them up was that they would sink these canoes, basically, with reeds in the shallow the shallow parts of the 5-lake system. So at the time of the conquest, Mexico City was just a tiny islet in this 5-lake system, mostly in Lake Texcoco. And there was shallow areas of it. And so the southern part of the lake system had fresh water, whereas the northern part had some brackish water. And so they sank all of these little boats. They created these agricultural islands where they grew all their food crops. And so literally there were canals that you could row through in downtown Mexico City. So people would go farm or harvest their vegetables on these islands, and then in their little boats row to the central market in Mexico City, in Tenochtitlan, and sell their wares. I mean, it was absolutely incredible. And
oh, go ahead, please.
Yeah, and so today, I mean, before there was way more, but today there's still 200 kilometers of navigable canals in Xochimilco, in the southern part of Mexico City. So it's totally wild.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really incredible. And if you guys aren't familiar with, I can't encourage you enough to go research that. And if you've ever watched any of the kind of, very popular Netflix travel food shows and they go to Mexico City, they almost inevitably stop in Xochimilco at some point and kind of spend a little bit of time on around the Chinampa. So really, it's really an incredible farming system that was very, very transformative for the city and ultimately the culture itself. So it's really a fascinating system. And there's some people who are, from my understanding, there's some people who are doing some really cool things to kind of revitalize or at least maintain to some extent that agricultural system as either a model for sustainable farming or simply in an effort to preserve that culture. Is that right?
Yeah. So when we started out with the pop-up, we started working with this project called Yolcan, which is now a project that a lot of kind of famous chefs in Mexico City are now working with and farming with. So we started with them, in 2012, and they had been working on just a couple of rented chinampas. And then they bought one, which is the Chinampa del Sol, where they bring people out, and you can see this beautiful like permaculture system that they have there. And yeah, they're doing an incredible job, and it's not been easy because the most of the chinampas are abandoned. I think 80% are abandoned, and then the other small percentage is being used for farming ornamental plants, which often use a lot of chemicals. And so it's something that I think that is now becoming a part of people's consciousness in Mexico City as something that's a viable agricultural space that could feed the city.
That's awesome. So when you say abandoned, there's just like these floating islands out there that nobody's using, essentially, or?
Yeah, I mean they're not floating, but they're what happens is that like when you're not maintaining the chinampas, the canals start filling up with debris and leaves, and you need to be removing stuff from between them, and so they start growing together. And yeah, I mean, and then some of them would turn into soccer fields, or, you know, you go in there, you can have like una fiesta familiar, and, you know, they have little like areas where you can go and like say hi to some ajolotes, little salamanders. Yeah, and then there's also some illegal kind of housing happening there, which is not great because there's no sewage system.
But it's of course inevitable when you have that kind of uncontrolled and just unmonitored, unregulated access to land, right? And you have a huge poor population. Of course, that's inevitably going to happen.
Yeah. For sure.
So I just wanted to highlight, sorry, I know that we didn't really talking about Chinampas when we set up this interview, but it's so fascinating. I wish people just learned about it because it's really remarkable. But transitioning back to NETA, so how is NETA structured? Because you guys do work with producers directly, you work with a co-op from what I understand. Could you kind of talk to us a little bit about the structure of NETA and how you guys have kind of set up that brand, and what models of relationships, I guess is the best term to have, you guys have with producers? Because it varies a little bit from my understanding, right?
Yeah, for sure. So Logoche is a community that was established by 3 founding families. So the Vasquez, the Aquino, and the Garcias. And so these 3 families over time have intermarried. And now pretty much everyone in the community, which is composed of over 100 people, are related through marriage or, you know, whatever. In 2009, 12 members of the community formed this cooperative called the Grupo Logoche. And this was to be able to access some government funds to establish a bottling facility and a communal palenque. In the early kind of like late 90s, early 2000s in Mihuatlan and in Oaxaca, I think there was this big push for these mega cooperatives. And there's a big one, which I'm not sure you're familiar with, but the Agave del Sur cooperative, which was established kind of late 90s and was kind of composed of hundreds of families. So this project was led by a engineer from San Isidro Quiche. This guy ends up ripping off all of these producers, and then you have all these like smaller kind of co-ops that break off. So the cooperative model is something that was kind of promoted by the CRM in some cases, like early CRM programs, and some kind of engineers who are associated with teaching people new distillation techniques and new farming techniques for agroforestry with maguey. And it was really to be able to like bajar recursos. And so they have this gigantic bottling facility in Logoche, which doesn't really make sense for how much they produce, but it's there. So we first, like I mentioned before, Max first met Hermogenes and Paula. We weren't actually aware that they were formed a part of a cooperative, or they had a cooperative, until like years later. They were like, oh, by the way, we have this giant facility and we're a part of a cooperative. But to this day, there's still the cooperative is just like a thing that exists, but it's not really leveraged. Like what is leveraged is the familial connections and tequio, and like the formation of it's a small community and they all do tequio and they all help each other out on their palenques. So NETA, we work with the cooperative for our bottling and labeling. And so we pay, the cooperative to do all those services they organize amongst themselves, and that's money that they divide amongst themselves. Like for the mezcal itself, we work on an individual basis with everybody. And what whether it's through the cooperative or just because they're all family and members of a community that's united. One of the benefits of the cooperative, again, I'm not sure whether it's a benefit of the cooperative or the community, is that they establish prices communally together, that we as a company try to purchase from as many people in the community so that we're not just uplifting or providing economic opportunity for one,
Right.
for one person. And I think that sometimes through the cooperative, if we were creating a mezcal, like I don't know, like one SKU, an espadín, and proof down to a specific ABV, then you start to obscure the authorship, and then maybe it's everybody's kind of like batching their mezcal. And with this, we're trying to promote the small differences that each family has. I mean, sometimes they're small, sometimes they're more than small, but basically everybody has their own recipes, and everybody's wants to be creative and express themselves through the mezcal. So we try and make sure that people's names are on the bottles, and that everyone can participate, and that we're selecting from what we think tastes the best. But they have a strong local market that they all want to continue providing to. So, we're not trying to buy up everything that they make either.
So obviously, I guess now after hearing kind of the backstory of of how Max first got to know these guys and how the brand really started, I guess it makes sense now that you guys have historically operated in Miahuatlan, because that was one of my questions, is why the focus so much on that particular area. I think that kind of makes sense, but do you guys have a plan to work outside of Lagoche? Is there not really even a desire to do that? Or is it a conscious decision to really continue to just focus on this one community? Because obviously working with so many people in that one community allows you to, to really make an impact on a wider scale, right? Like we were just talking about, not wanting to work solely with one producer and really, kind of over concentrate your business relationships through that one producer or family, what have you, or or do you guys have an eye to expand that footprint, so to speak?
Yeah, sure. I think that our commitment foremost is to the community of Logoche and the producers there. And also just on a practical level, it's like the mezcal is made there, it's bottled there, it's labeled there. There's a lot of transparency. And all the producers, I mean, again, they're family, their palenques are next to each other. So I think that there's a lot of accountability. But we do already work with 2 other producers outside of Logoche that are within the near vicinity. And they are producers that know producers in Logoche. I mean, everybody knows each other.
Right.
So we work with Ranulfo Garcia Pacheco, who's a producer in El Sauz, just, I don't know, 8 kilometers away from Logoche. And then with another producer, Aniceto Garcia, who's closer to La Chivana, also, 10 kilometers away. And with slightly different techniques and production styles. But yeah, I mean, we do have relationships with producers in other nearby communities that we'd love to work with and to export. But for sure, at this moment, we have so much mezcal on our hands that, yeah.
We do have a question from somebody who's watching on YouTube, and they were wondering if you could speak to the differences or similarities between the kind of system behind the Logoche group that you guys are working with, and other kind of co-op styles and that you see out there in the market. Not that you necessarily have to speak to anything specific, but he mentions like Mezcal Union, Banez. Are there other groups in general that operate kind of similar to the way that Logoche operates, or have you, in your experience, found it to be a kind of a unique model?
I mean, in Logoche, it's kind of unique because, it's not the co-op at this moment isn't being leveraged for anything other than the bottling and labeling. In the case of Banez and in other cooperative models, they're organized at a totally different level. I mean, it's like they have professional kind of administrators involved. They have like 3 tiers of governance. They have, they have contracts with farmers for agave. They're purchasing large amounts of liquid, which then they have different kind of like lines of product. One which is cold batched, blended and proofed, and then they have batches which are released as individual releases by a producer. In the case of Union, they work with, I don't know how many different palenques, but I know that they have at least 2 major producers or conglomerates that kind of like work with them, who have contracts with different palenques in different parts of Oaxaca, and then they're picking up liquid, and then they're blending all that liquid into, in some cases like 50,000 liter vats, and then they're proofing. So, I mean, the way that we're working is like, we don't manufacture mezcal, we don't put in orders for mezcal. So we're not like, hey, like, co-op, I need, like 10,000 liters of espadín. And then they're just going to figure out like how they're going to do it. I need 10,000 liters of espadín at 45. Right. That's not how we work, and that's not how the cooperative works.
So, I mean, in looking at some of the releases that you guys have done, it seems to, I mean, the way that Vago operates, we have certain expressions that are consistently available, but obviously we're doing batch specific actual production, right? So I see that you guys are pretty much doing that the same, or, maintaining kind of batch specificity, if you will, and batch uniqueness, but being a little bit more variable and kind of where you were a little bit more, variable, a little bit more specific about how much you guys are putting out, where you're sending it. For example, I've noticed that a lot of your things are kind of regionally or geographically specific with particular distributors. And I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that just a function of, this is what they, like you said, this is what they produced. This is the most feasible model to get this to the market, is to send it all to one particular distributor, to one particular market. Is that kind of distribution model really just based on the front end of things, wherein, or on the back end of things rather, because that's how much is being produced and that's the most logical way to bring it to market? Yeah,
I mean, I think that the simplest way to look at what we're doing is like, if you looked at us as kind of like as wine producers. So, we have every release of espadín is a different cuvée. And so if there's 200 liters of it, about 280 bottles, 300 bottles, it doesn't make sense for me to divide that up a lot of different ways. Yeah. And also, like, as a distributor, you're going to have to train people on this one cuvée, and then it's going to change in 3 months, and you got to train them again. And it may still be a NETA Espadín or an Espadín from Candido Cruz, but it's a different year, maybe a different month that it was produced, different flavor, slightly different flavor notes. It's never going to be the same. So you can know that, like, I really like NETA Espadín because I love, Espadín from this region. But, even then we might release a refrescadera one from Ranulfo or a double distilled in copper from Logoche. So there's a lot of variance within each of our, lines. And we're trying to promote, like, at least like in France, for example, we're working with Celso Garcia Cruz with this one Biquiche. So we started, our first export was to France. They got the Biquiche from Celso Garcia Cruz from 2017. Now they have the 18. Now they're getting the 19, and then they're gonna have the 20. So if you're a collector, or if you're, a smart bar owner or caviste, then you can have all of these different years of NETA Biquiche, and you can build from the same producer, same recipe, but different years, and you can build out some really interesting tastings. So we try and kind of work like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really honestly kind of it shouldn't, because having worked with wine previous to mezcal specifically, and saw the level of detail that some consumers bring to their collections, but nonetheless, it still strikes me as remarkable about how extensive and how well cataloged some mezcal consumers really keep their like home mezcal collections. I could think of one gentleman, Mark, in Kansas City, who literally has a couple of like black 3-ring binders with a text sheet of each batch of mezcal that he's got in his collection. And if he's missing a batch, he has no problem emailing me to ask, if I could put together a text sheet for him or something to add. So it's really remarkable how closely people really follow releases. And it's been great because, we track our batch numbers really closely, just in the interest of simplicity and kind of cleanness on our website and our blog, text sheets, etc. We have kind of a general format release for things, but if anybody ever wants to reach out, I think people know really well that, we'll get them the specifics, how many piñas, how much water was added to fermentation, post distillation, etc. Because, sure enough, if you put the information out there, there's somebody that's going to consume that information and want that information. It's been really, really incredible.
For sure, but I think you guys do a great job with your tech sheets. I mean, they're modular. There's a lot of information about the producer. There's a lot of information about the maguey, about the process. And so, yeah, I think that, I'm so happy that we have these types of followers and consumers and collectors, because that's what, allows us to do what we do. Because if not, then, we'd all be making some type of mass produced liquid, and it wouldn't be this beautiful, diverse thing that it is.
So you guys release as NETA Spirits, right? So obviously have made the decision to not certify your spirit, right? And was that a decision just because, did it go back to not feeling like you would have to change means of production in order to certify? Was it logistical? Was it a combination of things? What was kind of behind that decision, if you don't mind my asking?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been a combination of things. I think that we, in La Chihuisol, in La Boche, there's definitely been a lot of CRM presence, and the promotion of certain types of recipes. I think that there's been some changes in the way that the CRM maybe approaches producers today, hopefully for the better. But at least our experience was tasting the CRM, or like the certified mezcales from the same community next to the uncertified. We found a marked difference
really
in quality. And they were cutting too many of the heads. We found the certified mezcales to be more alcoholic and a lot less flavorful. And I've been thinking a lot about this idea of like the US or borders as these kind of magic portals, where there's a type of like flattening out that happens. So, you lose resolution. So, maybe like HD here in Mexico, we can talk about all this complexity, and then you cross over and you're kind of pixelated, and you're like, at 280 pixels. And I think that the issue with mezcal and what happens with certification is that, we have all these family recipes, And so like each palenque, they have their recipe for biquiche, and when it's cooked a certain way, they're working with the lunar cycles. They have, their history of why they distill the way that they do, why they cook the way they do, et cetera. And then, you go through, step one, which is the certification of mezcal. And it's like, okay, so now I'm in this category, and it's like, and now I have, they're telling me that I got to make this change and this other change and this other change so that I can fit in this category. Mm-hmm. And so you kind of like, lose resolution, some quality or some type of like specificity or identity. And then it crosses over, the border. And then, you're like, oh, this is like this mezcal from Mihuatlan with this, history. And now it's just, it's Mexican. And like, it's this generic Mexican thing. And, it's not, maybe there's a lot of mezcals that are being produced in Zapotec communities and, lots of indigenous communities within Oaxaca and in Mexico in general. And so you start losing a lot of information. And so we're really trying to find a way that we can keep place as much as possible. So how do you keep a little bit more of the information of what the product is in these different stages of translation and of crossing and of, this game of telephone where, I'm telling you one thing, you're telling this other person another thing, and then, et cetera, et cetera. Which is again which is one of the reasons why we've decided to focus on Mihuatlan, to be like, okay, like at least let's like have the consumer understand one thing, that this is from Mihuatlan. And, of course it's representing just, one of the traditions of Mihuatlan, not all of Mihuatlan, but, maybe something sticks.
Yeah. When you're talking with consumers about those decisions, do you find any confusion about like what agave spirits are, or do you find that consumers can pretty quickly understand the differentiation and the lack of differentiation between the two? If you understand my meaning, like, it seems like they're, given the enthusiasm behind that particular category, agave spirits, it seems that the consumers have pretty quickly understood kind of how agave spirits fit into the conversation of, is it mezcal, is it not mezcal? Have you found that, or is there a tiny bit more education that you guys have to do?
I found it kind of surprisingly easy. In a lot of cases, I think it's because mezcal or agave spirits or all these things are so new to so many markets and to so many people, that if you start them with this understanding of, like, this is something that's made with this plant, and these are all these different traditions. And I think I've been really lucky, and I don't deal a lot with maybe the end customer. I'm talking mostly to distributors, and when I was traveling quite a bit and talking to bar owners and all these things, people really had a lot of empathy for agave spirits and destilado, and kind of the reasons behind or the reasons why we've taken this route. And I think that especially folks in Europe who have understood some of the battles around DO wine and non-DO and biological and certified organic. A lot of people in those spaces, I think, have an intuitive understanding of the challenges.
Let me double check here. Let's see here. I have another question here from somebody on YouTube saying, so with regards to different vintages of Espadín, like with Candido, is it more that Candido decides what batches he makes and you buy what you like, or is there an expectation on the mezcalero ends that they will make batches that they intend to sell to you guys?
So there's it goes both ways. So for example, with Celso, he knows that we want at least one bequeath production from him a year. So he knows that, he might make 3, but one of those is going to be for us, at least. We haven't gotten to the point where, we've grown so much that we need to pay forward productions, or that we need to put in orders for particular productions. So generally this is like their way of life. I mean, that people are producing mezcal every year. They have, and I think it's pretty recent, in the past, like 6 to 10 years, this has become a main source of income, but it hadn't been before. So, people are just making mezcal. They'll sell some of it to us. They'll sell some of it on the local market. And that's kind of how it goes, and how it's been up to now. So we'll see how that changes in the future.
I'd kind of like to shift gears a little bit, and we kind of touched on it before, and I'm really curious to hear your perspective, given how much time you've spent in Mexico, how much time Max has spent in Mexico, and you guys being brand owners and living in Oaxaca and operating in this space. Do you try to keep in mind that you are trying to tell, when you're out in the market, and I think I mentioned to you earlier, this is something I always think about a lot, are you cognizant of the fact that you are telling somebody else's story? Does that make sense? I mean, I always feel that way. I feel very fortunate that I've been welcomed into the families that we produce with. I've spent an extensive amount of time. I've lived with these guys. But ultimately, like, I didn't grow up in a mezcal producing family. I'm not, the 3rd generation producer or anything. And I always kind of keep that in mind and have that, I guess, kind of inform the way that I talk to people about this. And I guess the reason I ask is because the category has grown at such a rate that it just seems like there's a big space, there's a big vacuum of people to educate consumers, whether they're associated with a brand or not. I see more and more people hosting their own mezcal tastings, especially, here in New York City, Brooklyn, etc. And people who are very enthusiastically telling what they perceive to be the story of mezcal, but ultimately have not, I feel like maybe they have, maybe they haven't, but have not spent as much of have not committed to it the way that you have, that hopefully the way that I have, it being my source of income, having lived in Oaxaca, as I mentioned. Do you kind of keep that in mind when you're out there talking to people about mezcal, and when you think about how you market NETA and how you guys position it, and the tone that you guys strike in preserving this method of production, even though you are ultimately outsiders?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Max and I try to think of, or like bring it into a space of service, or like thinking, okay, like how can we work in service of preserving biodiversity, preserving the identity of the mezcales that we commercialize? How do we document the stories of the elders of the communities who are linked to the history of this place? And in a community or in a culture that has mostly been of an oral tradition, like trying to write things, trying to share information. And I think that Max and I have really tried to provide what we know in writing, or like try to write things down, anything that we learn, to try and write it down and make it accessible to people, and not to kind of shroud things in some type of like mysterious, magical mezcal, which I see in like a lot of brands who talk about this kind of like some, copal incense, mystical, like spiritual experience. And I'm like, these are human beings with stories and traditions, and their stories of resistance and incredible things that I feel like we're very much honored to be able to amplify their stories and their voices in the best way that we can. And we do try to, at least like with any information or any photos or whatever, like, okay, like, is this right? We now finally, we have an internet line that's been installed in the bottling facility, and some internet in some of the family homes. But this is the past like month. So now it's a little bit easier with the back and forth. And with COVID, we haven't really been going. So we have one of Celso's kids helping us collect information on the batches and going around and talking to all the producers and being like, oh, is this correct? How many days in water was the ferment? But yeah, I mean, I think that, we live here, mezcal and the producers that we work with are very much a part of our life, and we have a stake in it, I guess. So I think that it's easy sometimes to kind of like, have this thing that you're extracting from a community and then making money off of, and not having that direct, thing where you're like receiving calls like, hey, like, we need uniforms for the basketball team. Like, can you help us out? Like, so like, I don't know, it's important to check in, of course.
Yeah.
And have the discipline and the sensitivity to be like, can we be doing better? Are we being accurate? Is this accurate? Like, does this feel good? Is everybody on board with, how much of your personal information do you want us to tell? Like in your bios, or do you feel comfortable with your photo on the internet? Like, how much do you want people to know you or to access you? So those are all things that we have to
where you live, like that's something I see put out there a lot. And the brands that I have a lot of respect for are the ones who are very transparent about, like, look, we've had this conversation with them, they want people to come visit them, etc. But yeah, it's just, with the amount of brands that are out there, people trying to establish connections between the consumer and their brand and the producer that they get to work with. I think it raises the expectation of the transparency and the directness of the connection that people think should exist between the producer and the consumer, especially with the advent of the internet and WhatsApp and things like that. But like you said at the very beginning, like, these guys are human beings in this modern world, and not to over romanticize the kind of cultural and that mystic portion of mezcal, which in my experience is very limited when I'm actually on the ground working, living, or talking to producers rather, and interacting with them, and when I see them producing. And to remove them from the modern world kind of, I think, removes a little bit of their humanity to an extent. But what they're doing is even more remarkable because they are in this kind of modern world, but at the same time, they are so easily exposed now, given how quickly information transmits, that I don't know, I think I'm so happy to see people enthusiastically talking about mezcal, but people just always need to carry it in the back of their minds that it's not necessarily their own story, and just always be thinking, what is the best way to tell that story? What is the most responsible way to tell that story if you're not incorporating that person's voice, which I think somebody would really, I don't know, especially as, I don't see that slowing down anytime soon. So I think there's going to be more and more people becoming involved in the mezcal space, more brands, etc. But I will say that I'm very fortunate in that the large amount of people that I interact with that are enthusiastically talking to their friends about mezcal, hosting tastings, etc., are very, very committed to the category, whether or not, there's always going to be some missteps here or there. But I think it all comes from a place of, or for the vast majority of people, comes from a place of very, very genuine good. You know what I mean?
Yeah. For sure. I just think that, as you mentioned before, it's just important to understand that, like, traditions are living, and the way that we speak about mezcal, the way that we're interacting in the space today, is having an impact, and it's changing the way that people produce, the way that people talk about what they do, what they call themselves. And so, there is, an exchange. It's not, things aren't static. They don't exist in, a vacuum.
Couple more questions from people watching. Do you see, and I think these are probably going to be the last two because I think we only have about 10 minutes left. Do you see any risks to the small producers from big industry or water supply? Good question. From big industry or water supply in the future? And also, what's your favorite mezcal?
I see risks, yes, from big industry. For sure. I don't exactly know how it would happen. I think that Oaxaca has this built-in resilience or resistance because it's so diverse, and because of the complications around land tenancy and customary law and ejido land. And, it's complicated to come in and just like buy everything up and be like, yeah, I'm gonna make, shit tons of mezcal now. I can see that happening, and I know it has happened in other parts of Mexico. However, climate change is real, and there's also in Logoche in particular an issue around sand mining. And so there are certain concessions for the extraction of a certain limited amount of sand. However, this concession, which says, you can take, 50 bags of sand a day, has translated into 50 huge trucks because there's, enough palms greased that then this becomes, this huge extractive project. And the extraction of the sand from the riverbeds, it doesn't allow for the river to flow through. And so you have the aquifers drying up, and it is definitely starting to change the landscape. And, if you've spoken to Lalo, Graciela from Minas, I'm sure, either of them could talk your ear off about the mining concessions in the hillsides around Minas and how that affected water and farming in their community. So, water is definitely an issue. And unfortunately, it's just something that happens at such a high level. It's corruption to the federal level, and in some cases, it's not even corruption. It's legalized extraction of resources from indigenous communities and from communities across Mexico. So with mining, you have a huge use of water. And then with climate change on top of that, we're definitely going to see how things shift. And I think faster than we all are ready for or have really mentally prepared for, as we can see with everything happening in California. My favorite mezcal, man, I don't, it changes.
Yeah.
It changes, but I really can say, and this is not just me being yeah, NETA, I love mezcal from Miwatlan and from NETA and the producers. I just think that it's some of, the mezcals from this region just happen to be some of the most enjoyable to me. I love Biquiche and Tepestate, anything that's super aromatic and has kind of copal, woody notes, I'm super into. So yeah.
And then let's see here. I definitely know what you mean with Miwatlan. I mean, we work in slightly different part of Miwatlan.
You're in Nanche, no?
Nanche, right? So which is out by the Carcel. But that being said, yeah, definitely know what you mean about mezcal from Miwatlan, particularly with the minerality that Amigdios has and the salinity. It's all the calcium in the soil just gives it this really beautiful, just chalky, mineral, dusty finish on the back. Even if we're talking about something a little heavier like an espadín, it's still definitely prevalent. That for me is just one of my absolute favorites. We have one more question, Gabrielle. Oh yeah, Gabrielle from Tuyo is asking, could some of the information that consumers are provided with, or kind of the exposure, if you will, of producers in kind of the modern mezcal environment, do you ever worry or think that that puts them in any greater risk, whether it be for just kind of unwanted visitors or being exploited or anything like that? Or do you think that, or is it based on the brand, is it based on the brand and how responsible they are sharing that information?
I think that it's something that you have to be like co-responsable, like you have to, I mean, it requires a lot of transparency on both sides, and like a certain level of rigor to be like, is this okay? Like, are you okay with people coming to visit you? Do you want people to come visit you? Are you interested in working with other brands? And like, have those conversations. But I mean, also producers are in their right to do kind of as they see fit commercially. I think that we have to be cognizant of the different systems of value that coexist in our world in the same, moment in time, where more money isn't always equal good, like, or, and there's systems of value, which also, and that I see a lot in kind of the communities that we work in, which are based on like presence and your participation in the community. And I'd like to think that that system of value, which is exemplified in this idea of tekio, creates some level of like protection, where it's not so easy to have such a kind of transactional experience with people, like to just come in and be like, yeah, I want, X amount of liters and buy, I've never spoken to a producer, at least where we are, who would be okay with that. There's like a level of trust that needs to be established, like some type of, I don't know, exchange, participation. I don't know.
Just time too,
Time.
Like working with Emigdio, we worked with him for like over a year, if not 2 years, before we ever actually started bottling mezcal from him and actually for export. I mean, we still have some of those first batches we bought just sitting at the office, just working on the relationship, because it was just it was only going to happen through just time and care and focus on working with this person and getting to know this person.
Yeah, for sure. And just to kind of make the point of how everyone's related, and Emigdio, okay, so Celso was one of the producers we work with. His wife Filipa is Emigdio's sister.
Oh, really?
Their brother and sister. Yeah.
Oh, no way. That's awesome. That is so
great. And there's a lot of marrying that happens between communities, people in Logoche, La Chihuizo, and El Nanche. So it's all in the fam.
I mean, there was one time that I was just cruising through on the way to Solo de Vega and getting into Zimatlan, and we just went to visit a producer, and I heard his last name, and it was Barriga, and I just asked him if he knew this person who Joao Barriga, who we work with, and is related, whose wife is related to Aquilino's wife. And sure, of course, it was his cousin, but this is like somebody who lives in Hacienda Tapanala, which is on the other side of the valley from Solo de Vega, and like out in the Sierra. So it's funny how, I don't know, all these mezcal producers are connected in one way or another. It's something that's really beautiful, and very, very lucky to be even remotely connected to it.
Yeah, for sure. And it gives you a glimpse of like, the possibility of regional organizing and all sorts of things. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Niki, for your time this afternoon. It looks like we have about 1 minute left, and to make it easy on the person who edits these, I think we will wrap on that good note of being just kind of families interconnected and being very lucky to be a part of that and exposed to it. So thank you so much for your time. Really awesome to see what you guys are doing, and I know that people are very excited as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. We've been fans of Vago for a long time, so I'm glad to be able to finally talk.
And I look forward to when I can actually be in Oaxaca and we can actually hang out.
Yes, and drink lots of mezcal.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Bye.
There we go. Are we off streaming?
Everything's off. You're good.